Bé, avui tenim com lliçó inaugural del curs, que no coincideix precisament en el primer dia de classe, amb l'Emanuel Christ. Emanuel Christ és soci d'un despatx suís que ha guanyat amb el SAC el tema del MACBA, el tema de la plaça del MACBA, i llavors tenim l'oportunitat d'invitar-lo a l'escola i és per nosaltres una gran sort que estigui aquí. Li presentarà la professora Elena Fernández y disfruteu. Gracias.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Ay, parece que se oye demasiado, me separo. Agradecemos realmente la acogida que ha tenido esta convocatoria. Es una iniciativa que surge del grupo docente Motores Urbanos y que fue acogida por la dirección de la escuela desde el primer momento con mucho interés. También damos las gracias a la dirección por haber hecho posible este acto. Antes de nada, también quiero expresar mi agradecimiento a Chris Angattenbein por haber aceptado el cambio del encargo inicial y haber asumido el compromiso de inaugurar con su intervención el curso académico 2023-2024 de la ETSAB. Pensamos que empezar así, dando a conocer una obra de arquitectura tan potente, es un buen augurio para este curso. Seguro que va a ser un curso excelente. Informar que este acto matinal tendrá su réplica esta tarde en el COAC, lugar donde Emanuel Christ, en representación de Chris Angattenbein, y Roger Tudor, en representación de AC Arquitectes, compartirán con nosotros el estado del proyecto de ampliación del MACBA. Este relato, que abarcará desde el compromiso de hacer un concurso juntos hasta su desarrollo en el proyecto de ejecución que hoy en día están desarrollando, servirá también para conocer sendos posicionamientos en relación a lo que significa el ejercicio de la profesión hoy y la afrontación de los nuevos retos que supone el futuro. Aprovecho también este momento para agradecer a Roger Tudor todo su apoyo y colaboración y ayuda para que esta jornada haya sido posible. Voy a intentar ser breve en la presentación de Emanuel Christ, evitando desglosar la excelente trayectoria que la firma de arquitectura que representa, afincada en Basel desde el 1998, es conocida por todos, pues su calidad creo que quedará explícita a lo largo de la conferencia que vamos a escuchar ahora. Por lo tanto, sobran mis palabras. Tan solo me gustaría remarcar que la razón fundamental que nos condujo a invitar a Emanuel a este acto académico en el marco de esta Escuela de Arquitectura es porque lo que hace y lo que es se debe a una conjunción armoniosa entre su perfil profesional y el docente, al conseguir que lo que proyecta y construye como arquitecto se nutra con lo que enseña y investiga como profesor. Considerando que la universidad del siglo XXI no debe acotarse solamente a impartir conocimiento, sino que debe generarlo, defendemos el perfil que representa Emanuel como el que la academia necesita para conseguir la actualización de la disciplina y que sea sintónica con la realidad. Por eso él está hoy aquí, para demostrar que esto es posible. La segunda razón de esta elección se apoya en que Christ y Angattenbein producen una arquitectura que nos interesa, porque detectamos en ella tres premisas de proyecto fundamentales. La primera, una concepción formal fundamentada en el respeto a la historia. La segunda, su compromiso a la ciudad y al lugar. Y la tercera, una esmerada y precisa utilización de la técnica, no solamente como instrumento de recurso de proyecto, sino como recurso proyectual. Todo ello hace que sus obras condensen el pasado, representen el presente y posibiliten mucho futuro. En relación al futuro, la sostenibilidad que defienden se fundamenta en la durabilidad, algo que no solamente se consigue desde la utilización de soluciones técnicas perdurables, que confieren a su obra una interesante materialidad, sino que exige la concepción de formas espaciales que puedan absorber nuevos usos a lo largo del tiempo. Siguiendo con su interpretación de lo sostenible, más que el impacto ambiental generado por los procesos constructivos, a ellos también les interesan los impactos de índole social, cultural y político que implica el hecho arquitectónico, algo que abre nuevas perspectivas de enseñanza, de estudio y de práctica de la arquitectura. Doy paso pues a Emanuel para que explique todo ello con más detalle y con sus propias palabras. Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
I was told to sit. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for this beautiful introduction. Everything has been said. I followed a transcript, the translated version in English, so I'm still working on the language thing, even though I consider myself a little tiny bit a Catalan architect. I'm inscribed to the chamber. However, this is a great opportunity to talk about our way of working and thinking. We are an office founded by Christoph Gantenbein and myself 25 years ago. So this is shocking to myself to hear, but that's how it is. But we also, in order to stay young and fresh, we could found a new office. And this is actually here in Barcelona. And this is a very recent photograph. So there's not even everybody present, I think, this morning. So when the picture was taken, I think there is 8 people at the moment, and we are very proud and really proud and happy to have also a part of our team here in Barcelona, together with Daniel Monheim, who is a partner at Christ & Gantenbein. And Daniel, sitting here, is also an alumnus, so he graduated from your school, the ETSAB. So we're literally based on your culture and your education, and I'm very grateful for that. The title of the lecture is not very modest. Let's say it's dedicated to Barcelona, maybe, so that makes it a bit more easy for all of us. I sort of brought 7 fragments of a theory of architecture, actually a homemade theory of architecture. So it's more like a sketch, it's an attempt to give you elements of theory of reflective working and thinking on our own practice. Because speaking of teaching and working as architects on projects, I think there is the obligation to again and again construct that bridge between the two, practice and academia. So let's give it a try. Homemade. At home I have, amongst many other things, I have also very many books. So, and strangely, this is just from a zoom in of a part of the bookshelves at home. But the books, they are the first thing that had really made me think of architecture as architecture. So paradoxically, more than the daily experience city and its buildings, it is only when architecture is referred to and described as architecture that it becomes architecture in the academic sense. It's a bit of a artificial, complicated, twisted sentence, but I really believe only through editing and publishing and hence thinking, we make actually buildings, or we turn them back into ideas. And I would say, still for my homemade theory, buildings explained as history of ideas or as a history of intentions, that's perhaps the entry point into theory. However, I bring you 7 claims and quite some comprehensive material on some of our work, and I try to find a good rhythm on that. The first claim is idealization, or the first fragment. Idealize the architectural project. This is what I would propose to all of you in here. And by the way, I forgot to say, I'm generally honored, but I'm also especially excited that this is still the beginning of the semester. And so take it as a proposition towards this semester. Idealize the project, idealize your project. And by idealization, it's actually quite serious what I'm trying to say. I think idealization of a project or even an image of architecture can be understood as distilling the idea out of an architecture. So again, we look at something, but we try to grasp the essence, which I think is the idea, something that we can maybe then relate to. So by doing this idealization, we make these architectural ideas in a building available for ourselves. That's very general. I even think we should be ambitious enough to idealize our own work. We do that carefully, but try to think big of your own work. And by taking your own work or our own ideas and confronting them and juxtaposing them with architectural history means that we get aware of the fact that whatever we do, you, the students, all of us, we are immediately becoming part of that architecture history. So just to make it not too easy to start with, we are constantly making history. We are producing, paradoxically, architecture of the past for the future, because that's where we are in our sort of relation to time. So I don't want to be too long on that heavy weight, if once we have understood what a responsibility this is also. But I consider that a great privilege and an obligation in our profession and also in our education, that we are aware of that perspective of time and history making. However, Christoph and I, in 1998, we literally went on a journey to discover that history of architecture and to become part of it. And we looked for these ideas of architecture in Italy, as so many did. So there is also perhaps a little sparkle of irony when I speak about idealization. By the way, it's interesting to see who is standing left and right of the stage. But so ideas of architecture inspired by books, and actually we made a book ourselves out of that journey, and it's called Pictures from Italy. There is a short mission statement, which I will not gonna read now, but we speak exactly about that relationship, belonging to history, trying to confront our own existence to the big one of our precedents. But what we discovered was not just the classics, it's the everyday of the city and its buildings, a normal house that we would find in Italy, but also perhaps here in Barcelona or in different many places. And by just looking and identifying and looking at this subject, I pretend we start already to design, and we start to partly own perhaps that building and the idea of a green volume with white shutters, for instance. But then we went on a bit less modest and started to create that juxtaposition explicitly. And this is not a proof of anything. We are not claiming the image on the right would have informed the image on the left. The left is an image of our own projects. So once in a while in that collection of pictures from Italy, we made the experiment of placing a photograph of our own work. But of course, one can start to speak about general things like proportions, urban space, how is the building addressing such a space, how does it relate to its neighbors, and so forth. But I have to admit, there is a slightly psychedelic dimension to that. Looking back into history, combined with planning for a time that lies far in the future, in a certain way cancels out the temporal in one's own work. So we could say a bit more accurately, and I'm quoting or freely quoting Tony Vidler, who wrote this important book, The History of the Immediate Present. The architectural project is immediate history. Once it is designed and once it is built, it's history. Architecture is designed as history, if you will. In other words, architectural projects produce history, and I'm at least asking myself, in this fragmented way of thinking a theory, that whether perhaps the true cultural, social, and political function of architecture is that they are producing history through their being. This is the last example from that book that I'm showing to you. On the right, you see actually a bar. The bottles and the glasses are not there yet, but it's finished as a transformation of an old chapel that was in former times an old house for a gardener. So also coming back to the real practice, the history, and adding a new chapter to it is our everyday reality, as I guess everybody understands very well. So with this first publication, we have demonstrated, actually to ourselves, I guess mainly, the book was not very popular at the beginning, but for us it was very important. We have demonstrated to ourselves with our pictures from Italy, we make history and we are part of it. And with the small, but at the same time very ambitious publication, we actually had no less aspiration than actively express this becoming part of history and to let it become a pictorial reality. So editing, as I said at the beginning, making books is a way of making architecture. So ultimately, Pictures from Italy is the idealization of our own work. Forgive me that I've shared it with you. Try to take it as an impulse. Take it as an invitation, and I'm saying that to the students, not for hubris and for megalomania necessarily, but be proud, take yourself seriously, and idealize your work in this critical and let's say cultural understanding that I try to share. The second claim, second fragment, reuse. Yes, we are part of history. I think I said it 7 times. But at the same time, remember, we're just a drop in the infinite sea of architectural history. So I would say, right after my first claim, the second is, let's be modest and let's learn from existing buildings. Learn from history and work with it. And we could call that reuse. It's a very fashionable term, and I think it's important that we use this notion of reuse. But I also think it's important that we understand it in material and immaterial terms. So yes, we're using building elements. We're working with the physical buildings that we have and their parts. But it's also learning the language. At least that's what Christoph and I did in the beginning. Learning an architectonical language from a building. So it's a reuse of ideas and of forms and of principles also. And then, of course, our design is just adding perhaps a new layer to give a reinterpretation, if you will. So I would also say, with all the idealization, we hardly ever create something really new. And this was, I believe, our first project that we could realize. This is a working model. I saw some of the students walking in with the model. I was really moved, and I think this is fantastic. So we've built that. Christoph actually built the model. I also build sometimes model, but then I cut off my finger, and since then I build less models. This is what's new here. The new layer is just the 2 stairs. Learning from old buildings. That's in a small town in the east of Switzerland. It's the medieval core, and the building is from the late 18th partly, and then 19th century. So it's not a very old building, but it's an idyllic, beautiful place with a small vineyard and this. Can you see the arrow perhaps? Yes. This is the house, and there is a sort of a barn next to it. Learning from old buildings. So it was about the renovation and a small refurbishment. And what I think is important, and that was then what we try to describe as a position, and I think it's still valid today. I think every architect or every design needs the realism to correctly assess its own impact. We have to see what we can do. Sometimes when we add a whole new part of a building, yes, of course, this has a big impact, it's visible. Sometimes it's a very small intervention. And we thought, if it's just a little door, then maybe we don't have to introduce our own language. Learning to speak in the language of an existing building. And on the right-hand side here, this is the new door that leads to the stair that you saw in the model. So we were hiding our interventions, and we were proud of it, and we spoke of camouflage. We spoke of the almost invisible project. And this is not fake modesty. We were really humble and also impressed by the quality that we found, maybe also by the idea of what we found. Sometimes it was just a coat of paint. Here, the whole kitchen was fully newly built with a new stone floor that we found just 10 kilometers from the town, locally sourced, still trying to be as close as possible to what this building or this house actually already was before we arrived. And then here, we're looking at the new bathroom, and all the timber work here on the right was newly built, learning from a building. So we took it very literally. I know, it's invisible architecture. Don't be all too disappointed. There will be a bit more visible with the time. We were very timid at the beginning. And this is just a beautiful photograph by this artist, Roman Keller, who took the pictures. And I thought it shows you well that, of course, reuse also can then reach its limits. The phone doesn't work anymore, and perhaps the small horse waits for some children or grandchildren to arrive. The third fragment of theory, I would call it big house. So you start to understand my inconsistent line of argumentation is a bit of a roller coaster. We idealize and then we disappear. And now big house, think big. And please, and I was making, no, it's not a joke, sorry, it's not in my script, but I was just sharing before we started the lecture, José Luis Mateo, who also was my teacher in Zurich, a very important and influential teacher, I think. He was very dialectic. And he said, on the one hand, this project is very good. On the other hand, it's very bad. And what do you do as a student with this? But I think this is the reality, and I'm not making fun of José Luis. I say that with gratitude also and with respect. Our way of thinking and acting as architects is quite complex. And sometimes it's maybe schizophrenic slightly, but this is our reality. And I think also you as students, you should adopt that notion that we are between these two poles. So yes, we are modest and we are humble, but also think big. So be also ambitious about your project. And I think every good architecture somehow wants to be big, or must even want to be big. And by big, I guess you might understand it, I do not necessarily mean just big in size. Of course, it can be big in size, but it's maybe also the word grand, And however, our first teaching, that's interesting, which we started in Mendrisio, I think the very first semester was called Dream House. So there is the idealization. And then the second semester was called Big House, that Christoph and I taught together. And there is a very famous text by Rem Koolhaas on bigness that I guess many of you know very well, also trying to make this the point that in contemporary architecture, but we're speaking in the 90s and early 2000s, that maybe the only notion that architecture can really matter is in the dimension of bigness. But however, we wrote a small text then for our students when we were teaching, and I'm not reading the whole text that we wrote at the time. But maybe I can just quote some of what we called the didactical purpose. By studying the potential of bigness in architecture, we learn a lot about the fundamental qualities of the architectural project: physical presence, order, and tectonical structure, rhythm, physiognomy, and expression. but also interaction with the site, we could almost say that every good architectural project is, in a way, a big house, even if its dimensions are very modest and small. Since bigness, the French grandeur and the Italian grandezza is not only about quantity, but also a matter of quality. That's what we shared with our students. This is not a project by a student, it's an unrealized project by Hans Pölzig for the fair ground in Hamburg, I think in the 1920s. A German expressionist architect whose work we still adore and love. And that's then a version by Christian Gantenbein of bigness. Again, not a very big building. It's a bank building, an office building. The model of it, we understand it sits on a slope, so uneven ground, irregular geometry for the foundation. And since the site was very small and it was surrounded by, or is surrounded by train tracks and bus lanes, etc., it stands there a little bit like a boulder or like a rock, and then it grows in size in order to create this floor plan. So it's a trapezoid floor plan, and the core in the middle, we could say it's almost a generic form of an office building with a flexible layer of space around the core that provides the service. In that sense, it's a very simple project, but the effort was here, and it was a prefabricated concrete structure that was giving or creating the body like a vessel almost. There is shops in the lower part. That's why there is little windows to the back. That's the delivery. And that was maybe our first big house, and you will tell me after the lecture what you think about it. It's still there, and I think it weathers well, and it has a resistant age, if I may call it like that. And in a way, we're also still proud of it, because it's very straightforward. It is bold. Maybe it's a bit violent, I also would say, after 15 years, but there is a very strong physical presence which I associate with the very nature of architecture. There is a second project I share very briefly with the fragment of the big house, which is an office and housing tower block. It's not a very high building. It's 16 stories or 20 stories, I believe, in total. And maybe different from the one that we just saw, I would here point at the figure. So I was mentioning physiognomy, Does the building have a face, or is it two arms? That we are naturally relating our design and the way we look at buildings to anthropomorphic standards or criteria is maybe something that I would also relate to architecture. We always measure a building somehow in relation to the human body, and also perhaps there is an attempt of seeing an analogy. However, we do not make architecture just for the fun of making architecture. There is always very specific conditions for a project, and I will not be long in explaining all the constraints for the project and the brief, but it's a commercial real estate project on a site that I consider in a way an almost impossible site, because there is a heavy train corridor running by with a lot of noise. Swiss law, it's similar here. If you want to provide space to live, residential programs, apartments, you have to organize the apartments in a way that you can naturally ventilate them without having too much noise from the train, for instance. And the train, you have to imagine, runs here. It's a train station actually here. And all the north-south cargo trains from Germany to Italy go through here, for instance. And what the result was is a building that tries to avoid the confrontation to the noise to a certain extent by leaning back, if you will, in plan. I hope you can follow the argument. And then what happened, different from the previous one, that was central with the core in the middle, the core shifts to one side in order to protect the building. And it opens the plan like a fan to the south. And then you see, I think this is a plan with only 3 apartments that then follow this, let's say, éventail-like plan. There is other floors where you would also have 5 apartments. So we could say it is an interesting battle between very heavy constraints and a seek for order. I believe making architecture has a lot to do with creating order. It can be a very complex order, and order implies notions of symmetry or not, geometrical patterns. We are in a very ordered space here, and there is a very clear idea about geometry and form. And this was our attempt to create an organization of space that is specifically the product of these very specific conditions of this building. And we might come to that in a moment. Would that ultimately lead to a new type, for instance? This is an interesting question that we were also discussing. And this is the building, the lower 3 floors, and the ground floor is shops, and then you would see 3 floors of offices, and then comes the residential. And you see, it's of course a bit of a strange person, the building. It looks at you, stares at you with the eyes almost closed. You can literally see how strong it has to react, how strongly it has to react to what the site is actually doing here, the noise and, in a way, the violence of trains and industry, which is on the other side of the train tracks. In terms of construction, it's a classic columns and floor plate, so that was in concrete. But the whole envelope was the first, let's say, high-rise building in Switzerland with a wooden construction. We had to protect the wood against fire, on the inside with plaster, on the outside with a shield of metal. That again was a response also to that specific context. It's galvanized steel that with the time also starts to change, and it looks sometimes like stone and sometimes like brilliant metal. So here you get a sense of that big house. I show you a third big house. It is a residential building that we could finish, I think, 12 years ago or 13 years ago. It's a 180 meter long building in an urban block in Basel, where I live, and where the bigger part of the office is. Actually, the office is very close down here. And there is the river, and it's a triangular block. Do you see the block? Yes. Huh? And it's a perfect triangle. And again, speaking also of rationality in architecture, a 90-degree angle is a different problem from a 60-degree angle, for instance. How to deal and how to turn the corner, that was an interesting problem. And you see a courtyard with an old factory building in it. That was sort of the condition. Here we see it along the boulevard. That's the linear side. We're looking into one of the apartments, and what we see actually is exactly the moment when the building turns the corner. So we tried to make the problem an asset, or we tried to benefit from that. And it was a competition project, as all the others were too. And here we see now a typical floor plate. And it looks a bit weird, but if you would take the time, it's in a way quite systematic. And we can observe the apartment that you saw was this corner here. There is another corner, but there is also this inner courtyard facade that is making a sort of a movement. And this is also interesting, speaking about ideas. Not everything can be described as an idea. And I know that I guess everybody is aware of it, but still, we need our hands in order to produce ideas. So this line, yes, it was drawn by us in many, many different versions, but it's not just for the fun of a more or less elegant or clumsy line. It was an attempt to create additional orientation in the courtyard, because the courtyard is exactly north, and by zigzagging, if you will, we create a facade that is slightly turning towards the west or the east, and also we could introduce a variation of the depth of the plan. So sometimes I say, we architects, we have to create our own problems in order to solve them then with dignity, no? But the problem is created because there are constraints. So yes, it is an artistic practice that we try to have as architects, but it's also very rational and strategic. However, what we tried out here is that we tested the potential of a systematic variation of one floor plan type. And somehow, by doing that, by introducing also variation, where we tried to say every apartment should be slightly different than the other one, we tried also to deal with the problem of bigness and of length. And it became an interesting research on the relationship of individual form versus typological principle. In the end, one could say it's one type and 45 variations. This is I'm not sure it's all of them because there is also setback, blah, blah, blah. But again, I believe the house or the apartment that we saw was I guess this one, no? And do you see something? Yes. I mean, that's the classic type. You have a transversal space, 2 rooms, the kitchen is in the big space, there's no corridor, so it makes it also a social center. But that social center, no, this was the apartment we had, this one space, it always changes depending on where it is in the building. I guess everybody understood. Sorry, sometimes I have a tendency, being a teacher for so long, I have a tendency to be a bit over-explicit, forgive me. But the claim here in relation to bigness would be that typological variation or variety might produce social diversity. We can debate that. I'm not sure it's true. Of course, there are small apartments and big apartments, so different lifestyles, families, other people. But it was also interesting to see that the different apartments, they have very different personalities or identities, and they attract to a certain extent, and this is true now after 12 years, they also attract different people. And it's it's a regular rental building, and it's I think well adopted. However, this brings me to the next fragment or statement in terms of my homemade theory, which refers to the notion of typology. So one could say, with all the bigness and the modesty at the same time, be rational and systematic as architects and see the bigger picture of architecture. And I would claim typology is something like the bigger picture of architecture. It's our cultural, but also our somehow historical and systematic context. And I share with you a feeling, maybe even more and more growing feeling of necessity of systematics. Maybe this has to do with age, I don't know. But however, I share this interest in typology with you for various reasons. But first, coming back to my library, maybe you saw, I have almost all the opposition publications from the 1970s. And one of them, I think it's in number 12, there is the famous text on typology by Rafael Moneo, whom we don't have to introduce, but I pay tribute to him and to his work and writing. He published this text in 1978. And I will not now go through the text with you, but perhaps it helps to just understand a few fundamental things on types. There is 300 years of theory on typology, so it could be a seminar. We cut it short. But what then is type, is Moneo asking. And it's important, he's doing that as a designer. He's not a theoretician in the first place, coming back to that. He, as a practitioner and a designer, he tries to understand in the 1970s, in the heyday of postmodernism, what can type and typological thinking maybe help or not help architecture in that very moment? And he tries to give a very compact overview on the history of type, but also he gives a very beautiful, to me and to us, still very valid description or definition of what it is. And he says, what is the type? It can most simply be defined, I think this is a quote from a line in the text, it can most simply be defined as a concept which describes a group of objects characterized by the same formal structure. So a group of things that have something in common. And another line that I like especially, it might even be said that type means the act of thinking in groups. So yes, we are individuals, and yes, we are making and designing our individual projects, but somehow they belong to a bigger family. And then he concludes at that point, architecture, however, the world of objects created by architecture is not only described by types, it is also produced through them. And I might reintroduce my attempt of speaking of idealization. To grasp the essence of a piece of architecture, to understand the idea, comes close to maybe understand the type. And once you have understood it, you can use it and you can produce. So that's the perspective of the designer, I think, that I see with Moneo. Of course, typology, that's just the second page, and then I move on, but it's closely related and connected to the reality of making, so to construction. So speaking of typology, trying to understand the principles also means that we relate to an intelligence of making and to typically economy of means. And I would like to stress that here, that architecture always, even if there is such a thing like a luxurious project, there is always an economy of means. And types are principles of organization to organize a limited amount of material or space and money in a very intelligent and most performing way, if you will. However, the very last paragraph in Moneo's text is, at some point, he asks the question, does it still make sense to speak of types today, 1978? And we take that 30 years after or more or less, we took that question on and said, of course, Christoph and I, being appointed as assistant professors at the time at ETH, we said, yes, absolutely. We believe it is absolutely relevant and productive to speak of types. Because somehow what buildings have in common and what makes them individual is, in short, the problem of urban architecture, you could say, or at least one layer of it. How do we arrange buildings in relation to others? And how do different buildings react to similar or the same conditions? So that's why the question of a new definition, or actually a contemporary understanding of the type and typological design, became a central element of our practical, but also of our academic work. And out of this, we somehow developed a big project, which was and still is, more a research project and a project of editing and publishing. It's somehow a big project on what we thought. We could describe it as the anonymous, it's not always anonymous at all, or the unknown architecture of the modern metropolis. And there is 2 books. One was on Hong Kong, Rome, New York, and Buenos Aires. So where we tried to give offer a catalog of a selection of buildings, classified, if you will. And it's always the ordinary of the city, the big mass. It's that what we think makes not the monument, not the exception, the big mass. But of course, going to New York, there is monumental building and there is landmark buildings. There's a second volume that was then on Paris, Delhi, Sao Paulo, and Athens. And actually, in this second book, we then published the first German, we ourselves translated Rafael Moneo's text on typology and published there. And I think that the English translation of his Spanish text is so-so, and our German translation of his English translation is really not very good. But for us, it was very important that we could publish it, and we also visited Moneo and had this exchange. However, and now we are working on a third book currently, and it will be different. It's another 4 cities. We are currently working on Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and Tbilisi in Georgia, Genova in Italy, and Casablanca in Morocco. And we try again also to see it now in the 2020s to try to better understand what is the relationship of these types to climate, amongst other things. But this is the catalogs of typology. You see, collection of buildings. It's nice, the bigger picture. This is 19th, no, it's 18th century when scientists and just curious people started to try to describe the world around them. We did it in a very systematic manner. The books are very helpful. We consider them as a sort of a design tool, and many students use it as well. They're that big, and I had a very small bag, so we already said we will send it to you, so you will have it and maybe in the library or it's already there. However, you see, this is Paris. I don't go into detail. Interesting moments when in Paris, in the beginning of the 20th century, there is still the urban block. It's Haussmann. It's of course the dense 19th century city. And there were first attempts to introduce more light and more air. So hygienism is transforming the types. And typology is actually almost ever about evolution. It's very rarely the new creation, as I said. So you can literally see how the traditional types start to transform in different projects, of course. So this is a very interesting moment there. And you also can see that the Parisian types, they still carry the DNA of the traditional Parisian apartments of enfilades and conglomerations or agglomerations of individual rooms. Whereas then in Athens, for example, that's just the second example I'm giving you here, you see it's the polykatikia. We found out in the end, modern Athens is basically one type. It's the system, the domino system, it's pillars and slabs, but you see very different, very different versions of it. Sometimes it's a garage, sometimes it's an office, sometimes it's a house. And all this research has strongly defined and influenced also our teaching. So we do that work of research not just for the sake of documentation, which I think is also an important function of science and research, but we also try to use it for design. So discovering the types and the principles of spatial organization, we do it with the goal of using these types and models in order to experiment and test them in different contexts. So adapting and transforming the type is an interesting moment. So we speak of transfer and transformation. And you can see typology transfer towards the urban architecture. I have to make the confession here, we couldn't resist, as so many architects, to at least write one article with the two words. We can also not do that, but we did it at the time. So creating the new out of old types. And to come back for a last time to Moneo, he stated, using types, working with types in that sense is not a frozen mechanism. It's a very active and lively concept in a way. And this brings me to the fifth fragment, collective authorship. Architecture is design which is based on shared principles, common understanding, and hence it's also possible to share the design and to collaborate, which we actually often do as an office, as you perfectly know, that we successfully do in different constellations, and it's an interesting and very fruitful understanding of architecture when you try to define a common ground. No? So designing with types, I said it already, is more evolution than mere invention, and it's about shared knowledge. And that's interesting when we are discussing authorship. And I don't know exactly how you see it, the students mainly here now, you know, the young generation. In Zurich, or I remember a podium in London once, where there is young students and they think authorship, this is bad and we should abolish, and we dream of architecture that is maybe free of authorship, because authorship is authoritarian and it's bad. I would say this is too simple, but it can be a longer conversation. But in any case, we all should be, of course, aware of the fact that you actually never design a building by yourself. This is clear. It needs the individual effort, and there maybe your effort, your personal contribution is in the end also just the fact that we are assuming a certain responsibility. So I think authorship is responsibility expressed in architectural form, but, and this is important, authorship must never be confused with ownership. There is architecture that is owned by the author. This one spectacular gesture, the hand of the master, typically it's a man, but there was also women to do that. And then the building stays for centuries, mainly that sparkling moment in Zaha Hadid's life, or whoever you would choose. And I'm not saying this is bad or this is good. I think also Frank Gehry is a fantastic architect, but the buildings are owned in a way by their authors. And anyhow, this, I'm not saying good or bad. My position, our position is a different one. We believe that authorship is there to be shared. And I put it even a bit further, and I could say, if value, then copy. And this is, by the way, a quote. There's a Danish, fantastic, quite well-known Danish artist collective. They are called Superflex. And they said that, if value, then copy. On our typological trips in Athens, we walked through the already closed fish and meat market. I don't remember whether, I guess this was the meat section. And we saw these small architectures, the stools, or these blocks where you would chop the meat. And we were already looking at it, the photograph, or I should tell the story slightly different. That's a photograph we took when we walked, doing our typological research. And years after, we were invited by a Belgian gallery, Maniera, to do a design of a piece of furniture. Now you get the story. It's a gallery collaborating not with industrial or product designers, but with artists and architects to make furniture that can be used, but furniture that is maybe a statement also, no? However, and then we said, what do? We would like to express this theoretical thinking of type and collective authorship through a piece that we would produce. And idealization. We went back to the image and tried to find an idea and to distill the type, perhaps creating a type. And we found this photograph and we thought, this is fantastic. And this is almost like a Greek temple, and you see the frieze, the Mytopia and all that. And then we started to make first sketches and try to understand how technically this object is created, with the bolts that we saw. And we were starting to imagine this collection or this connection of different wooden sticks somehow. However, I'll be a bit brief here. We created then a small family of 3 different types: a stool, a high and a low table. And we then get obsessed with the artificial, creating your own problem. Economy of means to assemble this wood without using glue or a screw. Just by putting these timber blocks together, drilling a hole, and then put one layer of sticks or rods in one direction and the other one on top of it. And so to create a sort of a fragile tectonic stability within that small object. Is it architecture? Is it a model? Is it a piece of furniture? I don't know. How big is it? Collective authorship. There is Christoph. I showed the picture because I thought it's nice. And you see there's other people as well, so we hardly do anything alone, the two of us. But we were trying to understand what the object is. And then we said, is it a piece of furniture or is it a building? If it's a building, maybe we should put the facade and render. And we were thinking of Site Twombly, putting white gesso on everything. So it's not painted, but there is a grain to it. And we started to cover and protect and to partly hide the tectonic of the object. The gallerists liked it, but they also liked the idea that maybe it could be wood. So that's what we had. Out of this objet trouvé, we created a small architecture or a small typological series. So I said objet trouvé, that was a bit of a coincidence, but it's an Adje photograph from, I think, from the 1890s in Paris. The brocanteur, so the antique shop, and of course, a little bit of art history, whether it's then André Breton or Marcel Duchamp, the ready-made, the found object on the street. There is also a stool on that photograph. And I thought it's a nice transition in my lecture to move on and to go to Paris. And this is another project that we recently completed. There is also an objet trouvé there. On the right-hand side, you see an existing building, and then that elongated silver snake or stick is a new building, a residential building for social housing in Paris. This is the objet trouvé, with the fantastic party walls, with the chimney, the different colors of brick. And it's a specific site. It's in the 15e arrondissement, so it's in the inner city, inside the périphérique. And here where you see the white or the light part of the photograph, this is a half-empty site for metro car maintenance and garages. So it's an industrial infrastructure site in the city. It's there since almost 100 years. And this is now to be repaired and rebuilt, the infrastructure, and it's owned by the railways, by Metro, by the RATP. And in the idea of using the potential of such a site, there is a project to densify, and you see perhaps here, if you can follow my arrow, this is a new residential building. And it's very interesting also from a social point of view. You were saying that, no? I'm speaking a lot about form and how forms relate to other forms and how we think about forms. Ultimately, every form, it has a function, a direct one or a metaphorical, a symbolic function. Every form is, in that sense, social and political, whether it's open or closed. However, in this case, it's very clearly stated. The idea is to create roughly 100 social, so subsidized or funded apartments for mainly the people working for the metro cars, because it's also about proximity and bringing, people cannot commute 2 hours in order to fix a metro car, a train. So they would live there. However, you see the context. It was a master plan designed by another architect, Dominique Lyon. We won the competition just for the housing on top of the garage. The workshops. We didn't design the workshop, we just designed the part on top, which is also interesting. That's the contemporary city. And this is the typical floor plan. And you see there is, maybe you see, maybe not, there's 3 entrances, 3 staircases only. That has also to do because the ground floor is used by this other function. So economy of means at all levels. It had to be efficient. The distribution system has to be efficient. The spaces are tiny. There is very little money, which is, of course, exactly the assignment or the goal or the challenge, especially in such a project. And what is interesting, we try to establish a type or a rule, And then there is exceptions. We see that the building has to attach on one side to the left to the existing building. The plan bends slightly. There's a little curve at the end. And this, of course, creates then in the typological system the exception or the special space. So what we saw in the other one, the zigzag, happens here maybe in a more subtle way. The plans, this is just one half of one staircase, regular case. You see that there is 4 apartments, so 7 or 8 in total for one staircase. There's still daylight that gives you a point of reference in the center when you arrive on the floor. And then every apartment has or a transversal orientation to 2 sides or a corner and terraces, and the terraces, they are used as loggias. So we tried to create a very dense and rich spatial environment with diagonal views. And I was referring, without explaining everything, I was referring to the typology the research that we did in Paris. And I think here, speaking of collective authorship, we very directly try to use somehow the ingredients and the typological understanding that we could gain from that research. So the result is a very rich variation of spaces again, classical, the enfilade, the different layers of space. It's small things. Every kitchen has a double glazed door, so it establishes a more generous relationship with the adjacent room. You would also see the diagonal view. You see that there is a loggia in the back, so an additional room. So even in a very small apartment, there is a certain complexity. And we believed that is not just making the space more interesting, it also offers additional ways of using it. And here you see the Eiffel Tower, and here you see a window. It's actually one type, objet trouvé. It's the Parisian window. And we repeated it, I don't know how many 100 times. What you also see here, the facade, is a light construction because we are on top of another system, so we had to be light and efficient. It's cladded with metal. Maybe you could say it's a bit like a train, but it's also a bit like Parisian roofs maybe. It's raw steel, just with a transparent veneer on it. And then we understand that it's not just the plan with the redon, with the meandering plan, in order to create these corners and to bring in light. It's also stepping back to the top. So it has a quite explicit plasticity as an object. So yes, it's a big house maybe, but it's attached to the site, it's connected to the context, and it tries to give a very clear, rational, but still, let's say, volumetrically expressive rhythm. And number 6, it has all been said in the introduction, so I know, I'm sorry, I'm just repeating what was said in the first 2 minutes of the lecture. But more than 100 years is a gain. It's a very unmodest claim. And I'm also saying that to the students also. This is a strange thing to work here on my paper or with my small model, but I was speaking of that responsibility. If we do a project and if it gets built, then it's supposed to last. And speaking of sustainability and speaking of a responsibility using the resources that we have, the very limited ones, whether we reuse or not, time plays a major role. And it was in 2016 in Venice at the Biennale where we presented a book, Idealization. And we just projected with light on the old 400 years old bricks, more than 100 years. And that's the book that we did together with the artist and photographer, Italian artist and photographer, Stefano Graziani. And it was called More Than 100 Years. It's on the Kunstmuseum in Basel, a project that we could realize in our hometown. But I would say it's more generally a small book about the problem of architectural form maybe, and its behavior over time. And in there, I won't read it here, but we made a mission statement. We said, and this is not easy to say, we said we want to build buildings that last more than 100 years in physical, in material, but also in immaterial terms. So that they speak a language, that they propose a form that can adapt to future use. I don't know whether we did that. Only the future generations will tell us. But I think this is our ambition, and that's what we should achieve in every project, whether it's in Basel or in Barcelona, for instance. But so it's a sort of a manifesto. That's the nice thing about publications. It's a sort of a manifesto for what we call the sustainability of form. A form that is generally understandable, that is open to the future, as I said, that is physically solid, but also a form that is anchored in its context. And that was the model that we built during the competition for this extension of the museum in Basel. You see here a 1930s palazzo, which is the main building of this museum that houses a fantastic art collection of paintings mainly. And here is a new building. Do you see anything? It's okay, but you know it perhaps. This is courtyard, big courtyard, small courtyard. This is the existing museum. And here is a strange polygonal object. That's the new museum. So speaking typology and speaking rational strategies, it's not so easy to extend the museum on the other side of the street or to extend the museum on the other side of a plaza. How do you relate these buildings to each other? There is maybe a physical connection, but there is also architectonical, maybe formal, urban connection that two buildings can speak to each other and maybe relate functionally and also culturally. I give you just a few images. That's the existing. That was a collage we made at the time. And I should also say the brief, the program for the new building was galleries only. No restaurant, no shop, no nothing in the beginning, no? And therefore, it is almost like a storage building. And you see here, there's a new building. It has its own entrance. It's at the same height. It's a bit like we said two brothers, or maybe one is the uncle and the other is the nephew or the niece, but somehow they're related. And they talk to each other at eye level. That's what we try to say. So there is analogy, thinking in groups, things that two buildings have in common, but of course it's also a very independent, self-confident, contemporary building. So it's playing on that ambiguity. And this is the finished building. It's a brick facade, different layers of gray brick, and there is one specific element. It's an integration of a frieze. You see the text. The text is shadow, actually, that we're looking at here. And what's next to the shadow is LED light that is just compensating the shadow. So there is a sort of almost digital intelligence in this very basic, archaic brickwork. And so it can display different patterns, and it can be static or dynamic. And it was quite an invention. So to challenge, in a way, the certainty, and perhaps it's also a bit boring. I don't think it's boring, but just a brick wall is just a brick wall. I think it's beautiful. But there is like the digital age left some imprints on that brick wall. So it can also move. And we see it here in different constellations. It's like an open book. Not many windows. Curators don't want windows. I think windows are important, and it has some very beautiful windows. But here I show you the brick wall, celebrating the materiality and the timeless expression. We could start to discuss whether this is pictures from Italy coming back through the back door. There is the interaction with the context. In the end, architecture is always real. I speak about ideal and idealization, but it's very real. And luckily, it's never ideal either in the end. And so that's the beauty. Here we look at it from the back, and we also can see that it relates to a series of other buildings. So I like to say, and this is important, a museum is not an icon, but it's part of the urban society. It's a civic building, and in that case, it's perhaps a cornerstone of the urban fabric. And here we see the plan. Old building on the left, new building on the corner. And I guess you understand that the new form is directly created by the circumstances or the conditions of that site. The plan, the typological figure, this butterfly, actually comprises two buildings within one. We have one compartment on the top right, parallel to one street, and the other compartment parallel to the other. No, sorry, that's the two sides, and in the center, somehow, where the two geometries collide, there's a big staircase. It's like the only public space in the building, and then we have some pochets, some add-on spaces as a third order. What I'm trying to say here is creating or designing a plan is trying to find the principle. Again, maybe referring to precedents and looking at other types, and trying to establish a very clear hierarchical order within the plan. This is the staircase. I should also say there is a connection under the street, in this case here, something like a covered public space where you see works, in this case by Jeff Wall. So I like to say it's a contemporary or an attempt of a contemporary version of a classical museum. And here we see the dialogue at eye level. And from the new, we're looking back to the old. We're seeing artworks. And that's perhaps what I like most about it. It's not a factory, even though it has industrial elements of architecture. It's more like a home for art in this case. More than 100 years is also true for that one. I'm trying to speed up. That's the Swiss National Museum in Zurich. I'm at 66 minutes, so I hope you have another 5 to 10 if this is okay, and then I think I can close. This is the National Museum, another extension. It has to do with context, with the park. It is somehow the contextual counterpiece to a 19th century structure, which is the Swiss National Museum. It's a new building that is almost like a sculpture trying to redefine the whole urban environment. And we like to speak of this place as a museum which acts as a small city or a small town, if you will, no? And also, every museum project, I believe, has a symbolic value to it. And here, I think you can see it very nicely on that image. On the right-hand side is the new, so the presence. The present is looking at the past, and they are looking at each other. So there is that relationship, but it's not just symbolic, it's also spatial. And we understand that the open figure of the old is sort of completed into a closed figure consisting of old and new galleries. The new building is, of course, providing complementary functions, and it creates this opening that you saw, a bridge under which we can enter into the courtyard. And the interior is almost like a workshop or industrial hall. So it's a different type of a museum. And it's very open and very flexible to use for many, many different uses. You can do classical exhibitions. There's the big stairs. There is scenography. There is all sorts of different displays. This was taken at the very beginning. But I like also to show that there is the possibility to change. And last but not least, for that project, it is a social space after all, no? And there is a square, there is a plaza, there is a museum as a background, there is a museum as an infrastructure for social urban life. And I'm mentioning that, of course, because I think this is important for every public building. More than 100 years, another town in Switzerland, I go fast, medieval town, one of the cross points over an important river in Switzerland, has had a bridge for centuries. The last one didn't last 100 years. It lasted maybe 60, 70 years. And we won a competition to rebuild this important bridge, actually sitting on the existing foundations. So there is a moment of reuse, defining the span and the rhythm of the bridge. But there is also an image maybe of an old bridge and of a long-lasting bridge that is informing the design. Without going into detail, It is an image of a bridge that is solid and that is maybe even massive, but at the same time, it's a very engineered contemporary bridge using concrete very responsibly. So there is actually a optimization happening where the concrete is mostly hollow. So it is a crossover of the arch bridge combined with the beam principle of course, minimal material use. This is a section through one of the pillars. And that's just recently opened. And I thought it's nice to show it because it's a symbolic gesture. The bridge maybe to architectural history, but also the bridge between the two sides of the river. And we get a sense that, again, also a bridge is a public building. Also a bridge is not just for the buses and the trucks crossing that important road, but it's for the people using the two river banks. So actually the project was more than just the bridge. We extended these retaining walls and made it part of a whole urban intervention. So that's the last one, and that goes fast. I only show you a few images. The ideal city is the seventh fragment and the last one. It's somehow the synthesis of all the before mentioned claims. And this is important, another paradoxon. The ideal city is a real city that is based on ideas. It is responsible, it is self-confident, a self-confident part of history, and it is humble or modest and megalomaniac at the same time. The ideal city is reusing what's there. It is big and monumental, systematic and economical, and it is based on the idea that it is collectively owned and designed. It's long-lasting and integrated into context. And I show you just images, and they are not proving anything, but they are also recent projects. This is a campus, it's a type of an ideal city, and we built for a pharmaceutical company. We built 2 buildings 10 years ago and 1 box very recently. It's just a box, but it's a magical box, as Daniel claimed it. It's open at the corners. This is the corner. There are big staircases, and this is the plan. It's an office building. Speaking of adaptable to the future, not every project is an ideal project, but ideally we can address one of the issues I brought up. It's an office building. You remember, a long time ago, it was an hour ago, I showed you the office building with the core in the center. Now stairs and infrastructure went to the corners, and it's a free plan. The only oblique and spatially dramatic moment is when the stairs are colliding with the field in the center, and we created a very rich and very flexible and very inspiring, and as we think, and the client environment for congregations, conferences, and workshops on all the different floors. And this is a double height floor in the center, I should say. So it has one specificity, and this can also be used with subdivisions, etc. And the only hint I get here that the building is maybe a bit strange is that you see the crosses. So the whole stability for the project, for the structure, is at the surface, because as you could see in the center, there is nothing. Another ideal city, for the sake of the argument, is an extension to an old chocolate factory. Old on the right, new on the left. This is the image of the poster. It is a still producing plant on the Lake of Zurich. In the meantime, this is in the city center. You see residential buildings around. It smells chocolate, but there is also traffic and heavy infrastructure. And this company wanted to create a public space, a sort of a museum or a research center, a big chocolate shop and a museum for chocolate, while still being a factory. And we liked the idea that we would add just another box, an industrial hall, but an industrial hall that opens itself to the public with this screen and the big entrance gate, like pushing up the wall. and give it it's glazed brick. So the white is glazed brick and the rest is red brick. It's very simple. Huh? I spoke about hierarchy and plan. You see the box and you see a bite. No, you don't see a bite, but a cut out on the left bottom corner. And in the center, we understand there is something like a big machine. It's a space machine. It's an atrium with, I think, 14 structural elements. We tried, and every architect should try to do that once at least, to integrate structure and mechanical, so like Louis Kahn would have told us. So we integrated pipes and elevators into that structure. It's 14 columns. And I like to speak of irrational rationality here. And you see the atrium during construction. I spoke about big house. It is a big house, and it's even maybe a monumental architecture that tries to give a certain autonomy to the structure so that the building can change over time, but somehow its skeleton stays. That was the model I liked. We also doing clumsy models once in a while. And here it was before the chocolate moved in. There is also offices and conference center and so on. You see just the open floors because it's just the columns and the facade that is load bearing. That was the last finished project. I have a few sketches. This is a hospital in Zurich. Ideal city because it's a university campus and we are building a completely new hospital out of the old. We are keeping and preserving parts of the old and we are adding new one. Yeah? And you see here is ETH, the University of Zurich, and this is the hospital, all that. And we won a competition to propose a new master plan to add these 4 or 3 buildings. Typological rigor, clear form, long-lasting, hopefully flexible structures. It's a big project. It's one house or one building consisting of 2. This is the building for the patients with all the rooms. And this is the building with labs and operation halls. And the 2 are, of course, related and articulated. It's a structural project. It's an urban project. That's the specific. It's in the city center. So speaking of ideal city, it's never ideal, but we try to work with what we have. And we try to create order and a framework that is solid also for the future. You see that this looks like architecture. This is the reality. This is just a few layers of the 3D model with all the different technical and logistical infrastructure. In the end, the facade of the building is trying to express that layering, and we are working on a system of, it's a grid, and it's providing shade and solar paneling, and is accessible for maintenance. So, but basically, it is framing the view from the inside to the outside and vice versa. So the project is in that sense, again, an attempt to create urban architecture that is strongly based on an idea of contemporary technology. This is the plan, once more, the typological plan of the whole neighborhood. This is our building, but the project, if you will, is the whole. Last project, this is our buildings. The project is the whole. It's a transformation of an industrial site into an urban neighborhood, mixed-use urban neighborhood. It is our project where we try to apply principles of sustainable construction by reusing material that we find, first reusing buildings that we find, reusing materials that we find on site, using renewable building materials as timber. And what you see here is the 4 buildings, L, O, and 2 towers. It's mainly residential, that part. It will develop into a whole new neighborhood, as I said, by reusing and transforming many of the other buildings. You see perhaps you guess the typological rigor in the project. I was speaking about order. I was speaking about variation within a system. However, I close with these images here. We're looking at an existing building, almost not changed, just reprogrammed, and some new buildings. We're looking at a dialogue exactly of this old and new. We're looking at a building here that is using parts of materials that were already found on site. Also, it's a printing factory, so there is remains of paper and cardboard that we can partly also use for the building material. Voila. And I thought it's more a nice way to close. I gave you my definition of the ideal city. You perfectly know that there is La Città Ideale, these very famous paintings from the 15th century in Italy. This is the one that is in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. That was different times. Perhaps this comes close to the ideal city of today. Thank you very much.